This is TreePeople's public lecture series where we uh, teach, root, engage, and entertain on the environment. And that's why it's called Tree Talks. We teach, root, engage, and entertain. I'm Cindy Montañez. I am CEO of TreePeople, and I'm going to moderate today's panel of these incredibly just passionate, wonderful women who are leading the conversation at the local, at the national level on climate change, environmental justice, and truly are people that we as Tree People go to and respect. Our intent with the series of Tree Talks is to address a variety of environmental issues that are impacting communities throughout. We have discussed low tree canopy coverage, the impacts of devastating wildfires, clean water as a right, the public health impacts of extreme heat, which we'll hear about more today, climate justice, the future of like what parks look like in open space and natural lands, especially as we see intensified development pressures. Uh, we want Tree Talks to advance discussions to really affect equitable solutions at a local, state, federal, global level. So please do engage and share your ideas through the chat. For those that may be new to people, we hope you will be inspired to join our fast growing movement. We literally have tens of thousands of community volunteers who help us plant and care for trees and native plants on our precious federal lands, local mountains, communities throughout Southern California. We are on a mission to just inspire and engage and support as many people as we possibly can to take action for our environment. We share our process as a model for the world, as we believe we are all tree people. So we love that we have people joining us from other states and other parts of the world. So to begin the conversation, I just want to acknowledge that the over 3,000 acres of precious lands that Tree People owns, manages, or conserves through Tree People and our land trusts are on the ancestral lands of the Tongva people, the Chumash, and the Fernandino Tatavian people, the original stewards of the lands that we now have the responsibility to steward. We honor our Indigenous elders, both past and present, for their continued connection and protection of one of the most beautiful and ecologically diverse landscapes in the world. We welcome all of you again to this conversation, and I want to go directly now into our Tree Talk experts, beginning with Jacqueline Patterson, who is the founder and executive director of the nonprofit Chisholm Legacy Project, then Jennifer Fearing, who is the president of Fearless Advocacy, a lobbying firm in Sacramento, and then Marta Segura, who is the first ever Los Angeles Chief Heat Officer and our director of our Climate Emergency Mobilization Department. This is one of only two chief heat officers in the entire country. So Marta is literally one of the trailblazers in issues of like extreme heat. So thank you all, the three of you, incredible women, for what you're doing and for participating in this conversation on why our voices as women are critical to be able to comprehensively address issues of climate change and environmental justice. So let's start. And I think personal stories really matter, and we want to hear from each one of you. With the first question that I have is, where does your passion for our environment stem from? And I'll start with Jennifer.
Well, thank you, Cindy, and see so many folks. I live in Sacramento on Nisenan lands, and I've been in Sacramento for the better part of the last 20 years, which was really the first community that I was able to stay and reside in and become part of, because I was a military brat growing up. So I was constantly on the move. So one of the things I value, one of my passions, does come from being a member of a community over a lasting period of time, and starting to learn over that time what folks really need, and what that even our local environment in Sacramento is most in need of. I would say my passion is still evolving. I'm learning and listening and shifting gears on a regular basis. But I spent about a decade in my 20s as an economist for a consulting firm in Los Angeles, and moved up to Sacramento and randomly found a stray dog one day and discovered my local animal shelter. And that began about a decade long recreation that turned into my profession, as an animal advocate, working ultimately for the Humane Society of the United States and lobbying the legislature, the Fish and Game Commission, the Department of Food and Ag, and even running a statewide ballot campaign in 2008 to end extreme confinement of farm animals. That morphed from there. I have a growing interest in intersectional issues. I was struggling to see the sole value of trying to protect the planet for animals that didn't really fully reflect my deepening understanding about the impact on lands, waters, people, communities. Wanted to work towards bigger, better change that impacted all of the inhabitants of the planet. So I started Fearless Advocacy in 2014. I represent about a dozen nonprofit organizations in the environmental space. I'm really pleased to work a lot on ocean protection organizations with groups folks know about: Oceana, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, Ocean Conservancy, and Pew. I do a lot of wildlife advocacy. For those of you in LA, I'm very pleased to have played a tiny role in the new Wallace-Annenberg wildlife crossing coming to Ventura. And then I am really probably most honored to serve on the board of a leading environmental justice organization, Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, that co-powers community voices in the Central and Coachella Valleys of California. So like I said, my passion is less for title and treasure. Maybe that is an interesting experience in my first 10 years of life in the private sector. I sort of tasted what working primarily motivated for financial reward left me feeling like empty and not as fully expressed as a human. And so this, like my chapter as a nonprofit advocate over the last 20 years, has really been the fullest expression of myself, and the opportunity to keep growing and finding other ways to make a difference has been really a privilege and a blessing.
Thank you for sharing that, Jennifer. For people that don't know about that Wallace-Annenberg wildlife crossing, I mean, it's truly spectacular. Going to be a crossing where over one of the busiest freeways probably in the entire country. And we will be able to have just nature function the way nature is supposed to function, where animals could actually get across and not be killed, as we have seen, bobcats and coyotes and mountain lions and deer and so many other animals just killed off of our crazy freeways. And so the work that Jennifer has been doing is really trying to be able to continue to have natural spaces the way nature is supposed to function, even in big urban areas like Los Angeles. So thank you, Jennifer, for the work that you're doing. Jackie, let's go to you. You are also an incredibly passionate woman. Where do you get that tremendous passion that you have?
Yeah, thank you. I'd say my passions come from multiple sources, both heartbreaking and inspiring. So the heartbreak, starting there so we can end on a positive note, is everything from when I first started to be aware of social injustices was definitely when I was when I was in undergrad, working in shelters for people who were unhoused at that time in Boston, and just hearing the stories upon stories of the pathways that led to the circumstances that people found themselves in. Working in shelters for families recovering from, or who are trying to address move on from domestic violence situations. And again, hearing the stories of how people arrived in those circumstances, going on to Peace Corps in Jamaica, and seeing being on one side, seeing the areas of tourism where millions of dollars are flowing through through the nation, and then seeing the homes that people were going back to after working in those places where those millions of dollars in profits were going to a wealthy few, while you had folks going back to communities that didn't even have the basics of sanitation, again, in a world of plenty. But also being in Jamaica, which is such a beautiful place. It's where my father is from, and seeing the bounty and the beauty of nature and what could be in terms of us living in harmony with nature and enjoying its bounty, but seeing those extreme disparities. Moving on to working around HIV and AIDS in Sub-Saharan Africa, and being in circumstances where I was in communities where people had to be buried at 12 feet under and 6 feet under because the cemeteries didn't even have enough space for the people who were dying from HIV and AIDS. But yet I'm working with pharmaceutical companies that are pushing for restrictions around the distribution of generic drugs so that they can hold on to their profits, and they're selling drugs at 1,000% the amount of what the generic drugs would cost, and the people who are dying literally as a result of people. It's the ultimate in terms of profits before people. And then fast forward to today with the environmental and climate justice work, doing the work of communities that have historically, whether it's communities that were murdered and displaced, and the arrival of folks in this place that we now call the United States, the people who are then brought over in as cargo in ships to become the enslaved labor for this nation, and seeing the vestiges of all of that in the sacrifice zones and the communities that are suffering. But then again, just like the bounty in Jamaica, reflecting back on literally driving through the Serengeti in Sub-Saharan Africa, and the beauty of like actually seeing giraffe and impala in the wild. And so knowing that we have such a bounty in terms of nature, and such a bounty in terms of the regenerative qualities of the earth and what it produces in terms of the world being 2/3 water, and the regenerative nature of food and energy that can be gleaned from the sun. So I see both like the tragedy of what isn't, but the possibilities of what is. And I see the communities that are rising up and starting to build the systems that are in harmony with the regeneration that is inherent to how our world is designed. And so I find hope in that. And then I find hope in being able to connect the communities that are in peril with the communities that have found the promised land, and helping people to be able to follow those examples, and to be able to build power to shift a system that is based on this extractive economy. And so that's kind of what drives me in a very small nutshell compared to the magnitude of it all. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie, for sharing that. And we're going to go deeper into, just vulnerable communities, right? And what we as women have done to address issues that impact people the most. Okay, Marta. I've known Marta for many years now, just truly one of the most passionate, dedicated champions that we have in LA. We're so fortunate to have her as our first ever chief heat officer role that she literally got into this a couple of months ago. So Marta, what
Yeah. Thank you, Cindy, for inviting me here, and thanks to TreePeople for all the wonderful work that they do and spreading this wonderful information about how the environment and social equity and social vulnerabilities and all the issues that you talked about today are intersecting. So in terms of my own story, I shared with some of you here that I grew up in the 70s in San Jose, California, where, freeways were coming up all over the place. In fact, I grew up near a freeway. We were being sprayed by malathion because of the Mediterranean fruit fly scare to agriculture under Jerry Brown. I just realized Jerry Brown was my governor when I was a kid, when he was governor the first time. And there's another backstory to that, but I'll just hold off on that. So anyways, freeways were being planned all over San Jose and all over California. And we unfortunately were displaced as a result. Not only did we live by a freeway, but there were more freeways going up. So dozens and dozens of families from my community, low-income community, mostly cannery workers or agricultural workers or construction workers who lived there, were all displaced and were told to go find housing somewhere else. So I actually experienced a lot of what frontline communities are experiencing today. They live near freeways. They're being displaced. They are breathing in air pollution. So that experience and many others of discrimination growing up in the 70s in a Mexican-American household really made me reflect upon, like, what is it that I need to do? So very early on, I realized that it had something to do with being an advocate because our voices weren't being heard, but also because of my father's love of nature and growing up with indigenous values in my household. I had a real connection to nature. So when I found environmental studies at UC Santa Barbara, that was what I gravitated towards. And I realized there too that I wasn't just a feminist, I was a womanist. And I want to credit the Black women who came up with the terminology, specifically Alice Walker, because what that means to me is that you're not just, advancing issues against sexism, but also you're anti-racist, you're anti-sexist, you're pro-community, and you're taking care of the larger social equity issues that affect your community and your family. So just real briefly, I think that kind of puts in a nutshell what inspires me today and what brought me to this point. And we're going to talk in a few minutes of how I think I strategically landed in this particular position and the other positions where I've been the first in. And I think in order to be any of these women that are on this panel today, you have to be creative, you have to be a hustler, you have to be a visionary, and you have to really be inspired by your experiences and the passion that comes along with that. And then the key thing there is then to transfer that passion, transfer that inspiration, and help others connect the dots that their experiences, as negative as they may be, could be an opportunity for them to then turn around and help their communities as well.
That's wonderful. And then maybe at some point, Marta and Jackie can get more into this concept of womanism, right? Because I think that's really important for us to have an understanding of what that means and how that drives like the work that we're doing. Marta, I want you to explain. We all have almost 200 people on this Zoom. Chief Heat Officer. There's only 2 of you in this entire country.
Yeah.
And why has it taken so long to have these chief heat officers? Explain.
Right. Well, I mean, for Los Angeles and California, extreme heat is the primary climate hazard that we experience. And that climate hazard is made more visible and tangible when we call it extreme heat or heat, but it disproportionately, again, affects the lowest income communities, the communities of color, because that's where we experience the highest rates of pre-existing health conditions like asthma, COPD, kidney disease, you name it. All of those pre-existing conditions are higher in our communities. So it's really no surprise that our communities then end up in the hospitals. They end up with the highest rates of premature death. And now heat and heat waves are not just in the summer, they're lasting all the way through mid-November. They are much more frequent, in fact, 6 times more frequent than they were in the early 2000s. And I think the reason it took so long for us to start naming chief heat officers, because the reality is you could be a director of climate, a director of resilience, a director of sustainability and do this work, but somehow the word heat brings a lot more attention and a lot more visibility to the work, and it helps catalyze and unify disparate departments and bureaus and agencies to then work on, so how do we work on the public health issues? How do we reduce these premature deaths and these excessive hospitalizations that peak during heat waves? So then it becomes this public health issue that is relevant to our communities, to meteorologists, to climatologists, and somehow has this unifying force that also interests the media. So it gives us a talking point and an opportunity to spread the word about social equity and justice through the lens or prism of extreme heat, and extreme heat as a climate disaster that's not just going to affect public health, but our infrastructure and our survivability as a society. So I hope that answered your question. I know I went into different
No,
areas.
it sure does. And then I do understand that my volume for some reason is lower. So I will try to speak up louder so that everybody on that's in attendance with us can hear. But so what Martha is talking about, I know we at TreePeople have done research where we show exactly what she's talking about, that women, especially African American women, have the highest likelihood of dying literally after 5 days of extreme heat, where the temperature is 95 degrees or hotter. And this was done on research that we conducted on looking at public health data in the Los Angeles region. And those statistics are probably very similar in other parts of the country. So Jackie, I want to go to your work. I mean, you have worked on these issues at NAACP now with the Chisholm Legacy Project. Can you talk more about this? I mean, we have seen, as we talk about the womanist movement, we have seen Black women be very active on issues of justice, the environment, climate, and literally are the most vulnerable on many of these issues. So speak more to those issues and what we can as a community do to ensure that that things are more just when it comes to issues of climate policies and environmental policies.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so certainly the history speaks to how there's a disproportionate impact on Black women in terms of environmental injustice and climate injustice in particular, whether it is on BIPOC women in general, I would say. But differential impacts on different populations. When you talk about BIPOC women in general, I think immediately of the oil and gas pipelines and the missing and murdered Indigenous women, in particularly in South Dakota and North Dakota, and think about those the high incidence of trafficking of and again people who are missing and murdered, and people don't even really talk about it. I would point people to a special that was done by Lisa Ling on CNN a while ago in terms of a popular story around that, but also I would definitely point people to the work of the Indigenous Environmental Network, where people are telling their own stories around this tragedy. We also think about the endocrine disruptors that are in some of these facilities that are disproportionately impacting reproductive systems of women, and the folks who are more likely to live next to these toxic facilities are BIPOC women. An African American family making $50,000 a year is more likely to live next to a toxic facility than a white American family making $15,000 a year, according to the work of Dr. Robert Bullard, who's considered to be the father of environmental justice. I also think about the fact that disasters have resulted in a spike in violence, whether it's domestic violence or sexual violence against women, and how it is too often the BIPOC women that are more likely to be in insecure circumstances, where they would be subject to the violence against women. I also point to the border. I've done work in Laredo, Texas, where the vast majority of the folks who are coming across the border are and seeking services at one of the centers that I work in are women or women with their children. And often what's happening is people are leaving their nations not because they're seeking kind of grand riches here. They're just trying to survive in place after their crops have dried up, or after their homes have been destroyed by disaster. And so then when we talk about the policies, we need to be thinking about immigration policies that actually not only reach out a helping hand just because we are a nation of abundance where we have it to give, but also taking responsibility for the fact that we as a nation are 4% of the global population, but responsible for upwards of 25% of the emissions that drive climate change. And so not only do we have people coming across the border and not being treated hospitably, but we also have in border crossings the violence against women that happens there. And one of the folks that we interviewed when we were doing work on this Women of Color for Climate Justice road tour, she talked about her sister who left her nation of Cameroon because, again, the breadbasket had dried up, and that was her work. And in that border crossing, she was sexually assaulted and became HIV positive as a result. And so, unfortunately, there's story after story of this kind of violence against women that happens in these border crossings. So these are the many examples that we see of this disproportionate differential impact, and I can name more, but also I want to name the women, BIPOC women, who are really leading in the efforts to address environmental injustice and climate injustice and really move us towards a just transition. And there's so many. There's Leah Penniman, who is leading the work around at the Soul Fire Farm in upstate New York around food justice. There's a work of Jihan Giran, who is with the Black Mental Water Coalition, but working in Arizona around water justice issues as well as energy justice issues. Walea Johns, who is out in the in California region with the doing work around native renewables, doing work around clean energy, and now is working with the Department of Interior. There's really just more people than I can name. Elizabeth Jean-Pierre in Uprose in New York, where she's doing work with intergenerational work with youth leadership, an Afro-Latina sister who's doing amazing work and leading on what just transition looks like in an urban context in youth-led work. So these are the places, again, where you see both kind of the passion that drives you, but also the inspiration that fires you. So thank you.
Thank you, Jackie, for that. I mean, I want to continue to follow up on that. Jennifer, maybe you can also speak to, why it's critical, as Jackie was just explaining, right, to have women's perspectives shaping the environmental movement, right? Especially, maybe you could talk about some of the key initiatives that you're working on, such maybe like the plastics bill. We see women having a higher likelihood of having being exposed to things like cancer, extreme heat. We discussed that. We could talk about, exposure to asthma, respiratory illnesses. Because of the work that we do, climate refugees.
Is that for Jennifer?
As Jackie was just talking about, it's women. Go ahead.
You were freezing a little bit. We just wanted to confirm that question was for Jennifer. Okay.
Yes, for Jennifer.
Right. Yeah.
Well, there was a lot in what you just said that I really frankly think Marta and Jackie would speak more to, but to your initial question around kind of what women bring to the work that at least I've experienced differently, certainly over the last 20 years in Sacramento, where it's still very heavily male dominated kind of political world. Most of the key decision makers are men. I can go from a room of nonprofit advocates that's largely women who are working in a collaborative, like community centered kind of people first orientation, and walk across the street to the Capitol and walk into the rotunda, and it's nothing but a sea of like white dudes in suits. And so I, personally taking the world, as it is, and continuing to try to challenge those men to be the best allies they can to create space for all of us and to have them experience women-led kind of policy making work. You mentioned plastics work. I've just come off several years of working towards single-use plastic pollution reduction efforts at the Capitol that were really stuck after 3 years of the classic kind of power of industry, power of special interests and funding. And when you had 70+% of Californians kind of clamoring for change, fed up, like on a personal level with how much just plastic crap is showing up in their homes and that they're then responsible for, but all the things we're learning now about they're finding microplastics in the blood of newborn babies now. I mean, it's just ubiquitous and everywhere and super problematic. But we were stuck in a kind of classic power struggle in Sacramento until we qualified a ballot measure, and it forced kind of 6 months of very significant, aggressive persistent negotiation. I'm pleased to tell you that a group of 6 women environmental negotiators drove the Chamber of Commerce, the manufacturers, the plastics industry, and local governments and waste haulers. Like, we really drove a really strong environmental outcome that the governor was able to sign on June 30th. And I'm still actually reflecting on what that experience meant, and frankly what it meant, what you got to see when women were really driving the negotiations on behalf of their communities and on behalf of the environment, when the power just in the structure of that situation was more equal than normal, getting to let that type of approach to negotiation and let our interests kind of drive the outcome was something I, in 20 years of Sacramento experience, not something that I've seen. And frankly, it got a 2/3 vote, bipartisan support, lots of speeches about how this is how we ought to do things. So I don't know what the secret sauce will be, but I can tell you it had a lot to do with the fact that women were at the table and we were the ones speaking up for nature, for communities, for historical racism and pollution that needed to be addressed, that drove. There's going to be $5 billion over 10 years that is going to be paid in environmental mitigation funds, with precedent-setting levels of those funds needing to go to the communities that have borne the brunt of our bad policy and investment decisions of the past, and who suffer the most from plastic pollution. So I do feel like I've just come off a professional experience that where women really made a critical difference. Even people like Luz Rivas, who represents the San Fernando Valley as the chair of Assembly Natural Resources, pushed for that bill to become even stronger because of the concerns of Los Angeles-based environmental justice organizations who said, you did a good job negotiating that, but not a good enough job. And Ms. Rivas was able to ally with those folks to make the final bill even stronger. So I am enthusiastic about the coming election, at least in California, while I'm terrified, frankly, on a federal level, where we're headed politically. In California, there will be 30 to 40 new faces in the legislature because of redistricting. And I'm very hopeful that a lot more women will be occupying those assembly and Senate seats. And this kind of decision-making and collaboration will become more of the norm as we go forward.
Thank you, Jennifer. So, I mean, what we're hearing all of the 3 of you say is it's important to have women's voices and leadership there to make change, right? In these climate and environmental policies. So I want to just ask you, tell us how things you are doing to amplify women's voices and perspectives, maybe some of the best practices you have found that have been successful in order to promote women in our movement, because I think there's a lot of us here that are interested in doing more to get more of these diverse voices, especially the voice of women and leadership of women, into the climate and environmental justice movement. So talk about things that you're doing, things that you've seen have worked, and maybe give us even some suggestions of what we can do to get more and more women involved.
Well, I think it's important for women to train and educate their young sons to be womanists or feminists. And the reason that I say that is because this mayor not just appointed me as the director of climate emergency and chief heat officer, but the woman, the African-American woman running the Office of Petroleum and Gas Administration is Erica Blyther, and she's phenomenal. And the urban forest officer is also a woman. Her name is Rachel Malerich. And I find myself surrounded by other women who are general managers in key areas like youth development, disabilities, et cetera. And we embrace each other. Oh, Carol Walker, another Black woman who is a phenomenal collaborative leader, leads the emergency management department. If I had been appointed to this position 10 years ago, even, with another mayor, I would not have found myself surrounded by women and women of color. So it has made a tremendous impact on this city for this man to have been raised as a feminist. So I think that that's another thing that women can do, is make sure that they educate their children to embrace these values of being womanists and feminists, no matter what their gender is, right? So I'll just leave it there because I don't want to take up all the airspace, but I just think it's phenomenal that in this administration, there's so many women and women of color, and not just in leadership positions, but in commissions as well. And we are working it. We are working that collaborative network and sisterhood. And even the chief heat officers, there's two of them in that I spoke with. One was in Athens and the other in Miami. They embraced me so quickly because they've been chief heat officers longer than I have, but they were phenomenal. Like, we're sisters now because we know we're in this fight together. And we care about the same exact issues that intersect with one another. So it's really important to recognize our movement as a sisterhood, not just as, oh, I work with you. No, we're sisters and we're helping each other, and we're protecting this larger family that is the California community, the LA community, wherever you may live. It is the entire community that can and should be brought on board to make the changes that we need to see.
Okay, Jennifer, your perspectives on that, and then Jackie.
Well, I mean, Jackie already modeled it by naming so many amazing women by name, you know, say their names, give them the credit, send people their direction, make those connections for people. I think that has a lot to do with something I've thought a lot about, that we need to get away from a scarcity mindset, the idea that only some of us can succeed. And so we need to like occupy the space, and you can tell yourself a story about how you earned that or deserved that, or your path, you know, you have a unique experience and can own your seat, but there's so much more space. And actually we're so much more powerful when we're surrounded by others. And it's just such a misnomer, this idea that there's scarcity in leadership. No, there's power in that, in there being more of us there together. And I didn't even know this was a thing, but I recently was reading a book that a friend gave me about big friendships, about the shine theory. So apparently it's a thing that I don't shine unless you shine. And how true that is, and how we just don't need to be worried that our sharing power or bringing people. I try to do this in the Capitol. I bring my community voices into the powerful rooms with me. I don't speak for them, even though I'm hired to speak for them. I have realized that it's so much more powerful to create. I get in the room because I've created the access and the relationships, but I could use that to get other folks in the room to speak on their own behalf from their own communities. And it is so much more powerful, because guess what? Powerful people, they don't like to say no to like very authentic, credible community members. Children are also amazing advocates in the same way, but bringing people to come share their own experiences, us being like, you know, finding the current power system the way that it is, and bringing more folks through it. And again, not feeling there's a sense of scarcity that only one of us can pursue our goals. There's room, and we'll also thrive if we're not alone.
Yeah, and it looks like Cindy's frozen, so I will I will chime in, because she did say I should go next, and say that yes to all that has been said, and yeah, and to this last point about really there's been a call for this to be a leaderful movement, and recognizing that there is so much space for leadership, and we need to support leadership. And that's the thing that we are really focusing on as the Chisholm Legacy Project, in answer to Cindy's question in terms of what we're doing. We're recognizing that with, particularly as we talk about Black women, that Black women are already leading and already holding so much in terms of whether it's their families, their communities, their organizations, the movements, and in the case of Georgia and Alabama, democracy. And so there's a book that was written, I think back in the 80s, called This Bridge Called My Back. And it was really talking about the ways that Black women were holding so very much, but yet we're being held so very little, in terms of, you know, even today when there's so much talk around self-care, it really again puts the onus on people who are used to putting themselves last, who are used to having so much in the way of pressures and feeling compelled just by our very nature to be in service, to be in a caretaking mode, that always tending to be last on the list. And so we as a movement, we as organizations need to really be thinking intentionally about how do we institutionalize care for Black women. And so that's what we've been working a lot with in terms of the Chisholm Legacy Project, is is working with Black women to say what do you need in order to feel held? What do you need in order to feel whole and healed? And what can we do as movements, as organizations, to support you in that? And so we're documenting that work. We're advocating for those resources to be available, whether it's healing justice resources, whether it's retreats or residency spaces. And in some cases, people just, it's been interesting as we've held these focus groups. At the end of the focus group, when we've asked people what they need, they'll say, we need this, just to be able to have a space to talk, and to be heard, and to be seen in a way that wasn't putting pressure on, but that we're here for them. And so that these are the kind of things that we're really trying to lift up, to be really intentional about ensuring that the care is something that's universally held, as opposed to being on the individual to care for themselves only. Thank you.
Can we go even deeper into that, Jackie? I think you're absolutely right. We as women, leaders, women that are trying to, continue to push for sometimes very difficult issues, because you're seeing people sick, right? You're seeing people in our communities, as Marta was talking about, Jackie's, you're talking about, Jennifer, that women especially, whether it's issues with birth, when they're pregnant and their child has some type of birth defect, or women who are again suffering from cancers or other illnesses, and this thing of us having to hold each other up and support each other, well, so that we also don't get sick, or maybe if we are already going through some of those issues, what can we do, or what should we do, things that you have seen have worked to like hold each other up as women leaders, because it is hard, it's a lot of work. I mean, I know that Marta, I could say that with Marta and the work that she has, she's completely underfunded. We know that. We have a huge issue here in Los Angeles, and many other areas where there are lots of trees being cut down and people being exposed to extreme heat. And instead of going after each other in a negative way, what can we do to support each other? Can you talk about how important that is? Because we have to be strong as women leaders, right? And we have
Since
160 plus people, 170 people on. Can you talk about that?
we didn't catch, well,
I think
since
she said Marta. I think she said Marta.
she said Martha. Well, I was having a very interesting conversation with Jennifer the last time we had this preparation talk, because it was assumed that mentorship was like the natural way that we can help other women, but we realized that we have to build our networks where we are. And too often women at work, no matter if it's the city or if it's Sacramento or if it's a nonprofit sector, we tend not to support each other at work. And we really need to reach out to other women, even at our level at work, because once you build that solid network there, then you begin to build power. And that gives you the ability to then connect with other women at other levels. So it's really important to try to create those spaces wherever it is that you are active, whether it's the advocacy sector or the nonprofit sector or city or government. Please create those really wonderful spaces and networks for women to not just build power, but share their stories like we're doing here, but at a more local level. And I think, Jennifer, I'm going to turn it over to you, because you had a really powerful example when you spoke about this last time.
Yeah, thank you. I probably most of us, as soon as you gain any sort of leadership exposure, your inbox floods with younger women, younger people looking to you for advice. And I can only do so many one-on-one coffees, right? And help people on a one-to-one level. But how do you do that one-to-many? And then more importantly, how do you really see that the power of all of these people reaching out would be strengthened by them being connected to each other? So for example, in the Capitol, just young women fellows or young women legades were always reaching out to me. And I realized how isolated each of them were in their offices from other folks who had similar roles. There's 120 offices and young women ledge aides in every single one of them, but each of them was sort of a separate entity, and no one was making a conscientious effort to like make sure they knew each other, make sure they could walk down the hall and ask a dumb question of a peer and be able to come back into their own office and be self-possessed and successful. And so I just started creating monthly lunches where everyone would come over to all these young women would come over to my office, and I just had to create the space. I didn't need to navigate that conversation or teach them a thing. What they needed was the awareness of each other, the introduction to each other, the realization that they weren't alone, and that there were all these folks all over their floor, right? That they were just a couple doors down from. And you just take it for granted that people, know how to create those connections on their own. And I think it was just from my vantage point, I was capable of seeing that those connections were not there. And it was such a simple idea that made such a world of difference for all these young women. And it was just more what they needed than what they needed was to hear my personal story. What they needed was each other. And I'm looking forward to watching them move through, right, the career rung in that space with so much more confidence, because they have had each other as peers to learn from.
That's right. And I think Jackie's organization is a great example of that. She went ahead and saw the need to ensure that these strong women who were leaders out there could be connected. And Jackie, I just want to see if you want to speak to that a little bit more, how you saw that need and you filled it.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. So just per the comments I was making earlier, the need was very evident through those stories that I told. But yet even at the same time, there's certain things that we observed that would be needed that we began to fulfill. And at the same time, we've kept in dialogue with women to begin to continue to tease out what could be needed. I mean, in some ways, it's been a muscle that we've had to really push to get exercise, because again, people are so used to it's not even a possibility in terms of getting what people need in terms of being to center their own well-being. And so we continue to ask the questions again, continue to probe deeper to try to make sure that we're filling these needs. And then we're really pushing systems, pushing organizations, pushing movement, pushing philanthropy to say that you have an onus to really fill these needs, to systematically ensure that we're filling these needs. And so that's been, fortunately, it hasn't been, to the ones that we've spoken to, there's been a real welcome and opening to be able to do that, because people have seen the folks that we've lost, the folks that are sick in different ways. And they've seen the leadership that people show, and that what we owe to people, not just as leaders, but just as people. And so we've gotten a lot of good traction from philanthropy and organizations and others to begin to prioritize the needs of the women that we're uplifting. So, and again, like I said before, when we have these circle conversations to begin to surface these needs, what has been neat has been the peer support. So as was stated before, somebody will say, I need this, and then someone else in that room actually knows what a resource is that could help them with whatever it is. And so whether it's at that interpersonal level, or we're actually holding a convening for Black female mayors at the end of this year, recognizing that so many of the Black female mayors are in those towns that or cities or municipalities that are in such deep need. And so they're holding so much as leaders, but yet we also know the dynamics of the questioning of their authority by virtue of them being Black and by virtue of them being women. And then you combine that and it's almost triple in terms of authority being questioned. So the challenges are great, whether it's from climate change or from other kind of systemic issues that happen in cities. And we need to make sure that the folks who are holding that mantle are also cared for as well. So we're holding this wellness retreat for Black female mayors to really talk through and provide the kind of a space for healing for them, but also provide a space for them to say, what do they need in order to be sustainable, to have sustainable cities and be sustained themselves. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's just really important to just highlight, right? Is just how we again ourselves as women have to take care of ourselves so we can be part of continuing to fuel our movement. Um, there are I think there's a lot of things that we, especially when we are in these positions as executive directors, owners of our companies, chiefs, that we can do to hire more women, bring more women into the environmental movement. I know there's questions in the chat of like, especially younger women who have never done this, what can they do, and what are some advice that you have for maybe younger women or women who are at different ages but are wanting to get involved in this climate movement, this environmental movement? What are some things that you would recommend that they do?
I think they have to be stay open and stay curious and be willing to learn. Earlier I was saying that, you need to be visionary and creative. So I've always been that, visionary and creative. So if I was asked to do something, I kind of went beyond that. I connected dots and I created a bigger picture of what could change and what could be possible with the limited resources that were given to me. I guess with the intent of really creating change and ensuring that more people were being helped and being impacted. So I was driven by that passion, but I realized I couldn't just do things exactly the way they were requested of me. I had to make it better and bigger. So always have a drive to go beyond what your work supervisor or work leader asks you to do, and have those conversations with them too, so that you can get their buy-in and build this vision together, and then really move beyond what's expected. And then that impresses upon your colleagues and your supervisor that you're not just in this because it's a job, you're in this because you want to make a change, and you're a change maker. That puts you in a totally different category than employee or a staff member. You are now a change maker within that organization.
I would add similarly, when I was much younger in my career, some of the best advice I got was to make, particularly as advocates, that we need to make errors of commission, not omission. I mean, I think as you get older, there's an expectation that you're learning more from your mistakes, and your mistakes can have a bigger impact. So it's important to, as you migrate along your path, to get that a little tighter, but at a young age to be encouraged to make mistakes and learn from them and not be penalized for taking that riskier or a more creative or coloring outside the lines like Marta described, instead to be encouraged by that. And that, I think, particularly for a lot of women who, I mean, I don't know if it's a woman thing or a me thing, but I tend to be I was raised to be a rule follower, to be obedient, right? And coloring outside the lines or doing things differently or not conforming didn't feel comfortable to me. But as advocates, like that's kind of our job, to like push the boundaries and stretch, whether it's resources or stretch our creativity or resourcefulness. And so I think I want to be an encouragement to others of that same spirit, that you want to make errors of commission. You want to be willing to take some risks. We need you to be on panels when asked. We need you to speak to reporters when asked. Like, you are not an imposter. Your voice matters. And yes, it's not gonna go well all the time. Like, there's gonna be mistakes along the way, and you need to not let that mistake keep you from trying a hard thing again. You need to like dust yourself off and keep moving forward, learn from it. I think folks, we tend to just get too timid sometimes and worried about those imperfections and those mistakes, rather than figuring out how to say you're sorry, say what you learned, and go forward with integrity and advised by what you've experienced and learned.
Great. Yeah, I think that imposter syndrome is very common among women and women of color. And I think that's why the sisterhood is so important, because we help each other get over that imposter syndrome when we're put in these leadership positions. And it's so key to know that you're where you're supposed to be, and you should shine, and you should multiply that shine. Very good points.
Yeah, and Martha, you have an all women team, right?
Yep.
Talk
Yes.
talk about why that was important for you.
Well, I mean, I interviewed a bunch of people, but those who seemed more passionate and intent on making a difference and had the greatest talent were these two women. One is Rebecca Guerra Day, and the other is Michelle Sangalang. And one is my engagement logistics coordinator, and the other is my policy analyst. And I think it was important to me to have a team of change makers. And these are the two individuals in all of those interviews. And I interviewed probably close to 100 people that stood out to me as the ones that had the most potential for making changes. And I'm going to be interviewing, hiring more individuals this fiscal year. So again, I'm going to look for the same qualities. And I want to make sure that our team is cohesive and collaborative, nurturing, and has those characteristics that I said a womanist has. So maybe that's why I gravitated towards those candidates as well.
Fantastic. I know, I mean, I'm proud of the fact that TreePeople has a woman CEO, a woman chief financial officer, a woman chief development officer, a woman director of our human resources and administration, and woman director of our programs. So at the top, you have we have women. It wasn't the case just 6 years ago when I started. But when we women get into these positions of leadership, we have to make sure that we bring, as Marta just said, the right voices, diverse voices, and more women leadership into our movement. Jackie, do you want to provide some comments on this question too? And we have like three minutes we have 3 minutes left for two, but so feel free to maybe give any kind of closing thoughts that you want to share with the 150 plus people that are still on the Zoom.
Yeah, thank you. I kind of forgot what the question was, but I'll just share those thoughts because I've been so absorbed. But I would just want to reaffirm the fact that as what's been interesting as a Black woman in this environmental and climate justice space, particularly as when I was starting, and then even as time has progressed, there has been a level of objectification, or a way that there'll be people who will want, because you're a Black woman in the environment, they'll want your voice to be a part of this, of the not folks like here, but folks who are as big green organizations and others are being pushed to around equity, then all of a sudden they're seeing BIPOC women as commodities to be extracted in some ways, because they need to be able to prove that they're doing this equity work. And so it becomes this kind of, one is constantly having to determine whether one is legitimately being called upon to do something, or whether there's this kind of usury in order to be able to attract funding and so forth. And so this, on top of the demands of one's community, one's organization, one's movement, then we also have this. You feel kind of compelled in some way because you want to be able to influence other spaces, but then on the other way, you're not sure whether you're actually being heard or whether it's just a performative type of thing. So this is yet another pressure that BIPOC women are under. And so as we kind of seek to advance the types of systems change that we want, shifting away from an extractive economy to a living solidarity economy, we have to really be intentional about what's performative, what's authentic, how we're building trust, how we're building relationships in a way that we're all, that as we're engaging with folks, it's really supporting their leadership, particularly frontline communities. And so that would be kind of my mishmash of recognizing I want to make sure there's space for other folks to come in closing as well. So
thank you, Jackie. Jennifer. your kind of lost thoughts.
Well, I bring that incredibly thoughtful and thought-provoking concept, Jackie, that I'm going to take to heart. I'll bring down. I'd like to close on maybe on just a very practical piece of advice for. I see so many young people and young women on this Zoom. I would just like to offer, I see too many women cancel themselves from opportunities, who read a job description and take it incredibly literally and see oh, well, I don't have 100% of the qualifications that they're seeking for this job. And so they don't even apply. Please don't do that. If you have a vision of yourself in a role, in a position, you should apply and use your cover letter as the opportunity to close those gaps. You may be the most qualified person who applies for that job. Sure, they may want their perfect candidate, may have all of those things, but they may not find their perfect candidate, and you may be that person. And if you can't even visualize and sell yourself in that role, you ought to be able to. And so I try so hard to express this to folks, because I do think this is a very gendered thing. I don't see men reading the fine print of job descriptions and deciding that they're not qualified and therefore not applying. So I just want to encourage all the young women here. That is probably how the most specific way that I see that I got ahead was I kept visualizing myself in a role that I wanted for myself and just going out and making it happen. And job qualifications be damned. I just barreled forward in pursuit of what I wanted and built the team that I needed to do it. So say yes to yourself is what I would say.
Thank you, Jennifer. Marta.
I agree with everything that was just said. I think the opposite is kind of also true. When I got into this position, there were even colleagues at the city that said, oh, they didn't hire a technical person, they hired you. And I'm like, what are you saying? I have a master's degree in environmental health sciences. I've done air monitoring, industrial hygiene monitoring, so I have technical expertise, public health expertise, community engagement expertise, but they kind of siloed me as the public engagement person. So it was fascinating to see, and that's why women have imposter syndrome, because you're put into a bucket and that's how people see you. And then you begin to see yourself the way that they see you. And I had to stand my ground and tell all of these leaders at the city of LA, no. I have all of the above. And let's just get that straight. So, sometimes you just have to defend your expertise. And even if you just like Jennifer said, even if you didn't have all the qualifications that job went for, but you feel you're the right person for that job, go for it. Either way, you deserve to be there. If you want that job and you feel you're prepared for that job or that position or that advocacy role, go for it. That's great advice.
All righty, amen to all that. Thank you, Marta, Jackie, for